My husband tore up my mother's photo during dinner, and his sister said, "Finally." I picked up the pieces in silence, but after one call, the dinner ended abruptly. None of them had a key to the house anymore. That's how it ended, but let me tell you how 20 years of my life led to that single moment of clarity. I was arranging the last touches on the dining room table when I heard James's car pulling into the driveway. The sound of his engine always made my stomach tighten these days, though I couldn't quite explain why. Maybe it was the way he'd been looking at me lately, like I was something he was trying to solve rather than love. The house smelled of roast beef and rosemary, the way my mother used to make it on Sundays. I'd spent the entire afternoon preparing James's favorite meal, hoping to recapture some warmth between us. The dining room looked perfect under the soft chandelier light, the good china gleaming on the mahogany table that had belonged to my parents. In the center of the table, in its usual place, sat the small silver frame holding my mother's photograph.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
It was taken just months before she died, her smile radiant despite the illness that was already stealing her away. I touched the frame gently, a habit I'd developed over the 3 years since her passing. "Eleanor, we're here!" James's voice boomed through the front door, followed by the sharp click of heels on hardwood. Susan. His sister always announced herself like she owned the place, which had always bothered me in a way I couldn't articulate. I smoothed my dress and walked to greet them, forcing my practiced smile. James looked handsome in his navy blazer, his salt and pepper hair perfectly styled. At 58, he still turned heads, and he knew it. Susan followed behind him, her blonde hair sleek, and her expression already scanning the house with that critical eye she'd perfected. "Something smells wonderful," James said, kissing my cheek with the mechanical affection of long marriage. His lips felt cold against my skin. "Hello, Eleanor," Susan said, her voice carrying that particular tone she reserved for me. Not quite condescending, but close enough to make me feel small. "The house looks clean." The way she said it made it sound like an accusation rather than a compliment. I'd spent hours cleaning, of course. I always did when Susan came over, though nothing ever seemed to meet her standards. "Thank you," I replied quietly, taking their coats. "Dinner's ready whenever you are." As we settled around the dining table, I noticed Susan's eyes immediately go to my mother's photograph. She'd always had something to say about it, usually wrapped in concern that felt more like criticism. "The roast looks perfect, honey," James said, carving with practiced efficiency. "Doesn't it, Susan?" Susan murmured, still staring at the photograph. "Eleanor, don't you think it's time to, I don't know, maybe put some of these old things away? It's been 3 years." My hand stilled on my water glass. This wasn't the first time she'd suggested I remove traces of my mother from the house. But tonight, something in her tone felt different, more insistent. "I like having her here," I said softly, surprised by the defensiveness in my own voice. James set down his carving knife with more force than necessary. "Susan has a point, Eleanor. You need to move forward. This constant shrine to your mother isn't healthy." The word shrine hit me like a slap. It was one photograph, in one frame, on my own dining table. But the way he said it made it sound like some obsessive monument to grief. "She's my mother," I whispered, hating how weak I sounded. "Was," Susan corrected sharply. "She was your mother." Past tense. Something cold settled in my chest. I looked at James, waiting for him to defend me, to tell his sister that she'd crossed a line. Instead, he was nodding, as if Susan had said something profound. "You know what your problem is, Eleanor?" James continued, his voice taking on that lecturing tone that had become increasingly common. "You live in the past. You cling to dead people instead of focusing on the living ones right in front of you." I felt my cheeks burning. "That's not true. It is true," he interrupted, reaching across the table. Before I could react, his hand closed around my mother's photograph. "This obsession with your mother is unhealthy. It's affecting our marriage." "James, please don't." But he was already lifting the frame, his fingers gripping it tightly. I watched in horror as he pulled the photograph from its protective glass, the paper fragile in his large hands. "You want to know what I think?" he said, his voice rising. I think you love this dead woman more than your living husband. That's not— The sound of tearing paper cut through my protest. Sharp, deliberate, final. He ripped the photograph down the middle, right through my mother's smiling face. Then again and again, until her image was nothing but scattered pieces falling onto the white tablecloth like snow. The silence that followed was deafening. I stared at the fragments of my mother's face, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. 20 years of marriage, and I had never seen such deliberate cruelty in my husband's eyes. Then Susan started clapping. "Finally!" she exclaimed, her voice bright with satisfaction. "Finally! Someone had the courage to do what needed to be done. Honestly, Eleanor, it's about time someone helped you face reality." I looked up at her. This woman who had never liked me, who had spent 2 decades making subtle comments about my worthiness to be part of their family. Her face was glowing with triumph, as if she'd just witnessed a long-awaited victory. James was watching me carefully, waiting for my reaction, probably expecting tears or anger or some kind of emotional breakdown that would justify his actions. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Absolute clarity. I began picking up the pieces of the photograph, one by one, my movements deliberate and calm. Neither of them spoke as I gathered every fragment, placing them carefully in my palm. My mother's eyes, torn but still kind, her smile, fractured but still warm. "Eleanor," James said finally, his voice softer now, as if he was beginning to realize he might have gone too far. "I didn't mean to—" "Yes, you did," I said quietly, still collecting pieces. "You meant every bit of it." The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 8 o'clock, its deep notes echoing through the house. My house. The house my parents had left me. The house I'd shared with James for 20 years, but which had always, legally and emotionally, belonged to me. I stood up, the pieces of my mother's photograph cupped in my hands like broken treasure. Susan was smirking at James, proud of their shared victory over my sentimentality. They had no idea what they had just awakened. "Excuse me," I said politely, my voice steadier than it had been in years. "I need to take a phone call." As I walked toward the kitchen, I heard Susan whisper to James, "Do you think she's finally getting it?" I paused at the kitchen doorway, my back still to them, getting it. As if understanding my place, accepting my diminishment, was some kind of enlightenment I'd been too stupid to grasp. 20 years of walking on eggshells in my own home. 20 years of pretending their constant criticism was concern. 20 years of being made to feel like a guest in the house my parents had died to leave me. The phone was ringing, and something told me this call was going to change everything. I answered the phone with my free hand, the torn pieces of my mother's photograph still cradled in the other. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "Hello? Mrs. Eleanor Patterson? This is Richard Holbrook from Holbrook, Myers and Associates. I apologize for calling so late, but I've been trying to reach you all week." A lawyer. My stomach clenched. "What's this regarding?" "I'm afraid I have some concerning news about your property. There's been an attempt to file documents claiming you're mentally incompetent to manage your own affairs. The petition was submitted by your husband, James Patterson." The kitchen seemed to tilt around me. I gripped the edge of the counter, the torn photograph pieces fluttering to the floor like autumn leaves. "What?" "The petition requests guardianship over you and your assets, specifically the property at 1247 Maple Avenue." "That's your residence, correct?" "Yes, but I don't understand. James can't just—" "He can't, and he didn't succeed. The petition was denied because it lacked proper medical documentation and your signature on several key documents. But Mrs. Patterson, I need you to understand something. If this petition had been approved, your husband would have gained complete control over your house, your finances, everything." I sank into the kitchen chair, my legs suddenly unable to support me. Through the doorway, I could hear James and Susan's low voices, punctuated by occasional laughter. They thought they'd broken me tonight. They had no idea what they'd actually done. "When was this filed?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. 3 weeks ago." I've been retained by, well, I can't reveal my client's identity over the phone, but someone who cares about your welfare became aware of the situation and hired me to protect your interests. 3 weeks ago. I tried to remember what had happened 3 weeks ago. James had been unusually affectionate, bringing me flowers, suggesting we have dinner out more often. I'd thought he was trying to reconnect with me. Instead, he'd been setting me up. Mrs. Patterson, are you still there? Yes, I'm here. What happens now? That depends on you. The person who hired me left very specific instructions. I was to call you only if and when you experienced what they termed a breaking point with your family's treatment. They said you'd know what that meant when it happened, a breaking point. I looked down at the pieces of my mother's photographs scattered across the linoleum floor. If this wasn't a breaking point, I didn't know what was. Who hired you? I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer. Your mother, Mrs. Patterson. Helen Morrison retained our services 2 years before her death. She was very specific about the circumstances under which we should contact you. My mother, even from beyond the grave, she was still trying to protect me. Tears started flowing then, not from sadness but from a strange mixture of grief and gratitude. Somehow she'd known this day would come. She left a sealed letter with us, Mr. Holbrook continued, along with some interesting documentation about your husband's financial activities. She was quite thorough in her preparations. What kind of documentation? I think this conversation should continue in person. Mrs. Patterson, are you free tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock? I glanced toward the dining room, where James and Susan were probably discussing my breakdown and planning their next move. Yes, I'll be there. Excellent. And Mrs. Patterson, don't let on that we've spoken. Your mother was very clear about that. She said to trust no one until you had all the facts. After I hung up, I stood in my kitchen for a long moment, trying to process what I'd just learned. My husband had tried to have me declared mentally incompetent. My mother had somehow anticipated this and prepared for it. And tomorrow, I would learn what other secrets had been hidden from me. I bent down and carefully collected the pieces of the photograph again, my hands steadier now. As I gathered the fragments, something shifted inside me. The woman who had meekly accepted 20 years of subtle abuse was gone. In her place stood someone I hadn't been in a very long time, someone who was angry. Eleanor? James's voice called from the dining room. Everything all right in there? Fine, I called back, surprised by how normal my voice sounded. Just finishing up. I walked back to the dining room, where James and Susan were deep in conversation that stopped abruptly when I appeared. Susan's eyes immediately went to my hands, still cupped around the torn photograph pieces. Oh, Eleanor, she said with mock sympathy, you don't need to keep carrying those around. It's just making everything harder for you. Yes, James agreed, standing up and moving toward me with the careful approach of someone dealing with a fragile person. Why don't you let me throw those away for you? You'll feel better once you let go. Let go. How many times had they used those words to manipulate me? Let go of my mother's memory. Let go of my opinions. Let go of my dignity. Let go of my home. No, I said quietly. I think I'll keep them. James's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Eleanor, we've talked about this. This obsession isn't healthy. Susan and I are concerned about you. Concerned? Right. So concerned that he'd tried to have me declared incompetent behind my back. I'm fine, I said, closing my fist around the photograph pieces. Actually, I'm better than I've been in years. Susan and James exchanged a look that I recognized now for what it was. Not concern, but calculation. They were probably wondering if tonight's performance had been enough to support another petition for guardianship. Well, Susan said, standing and smoothing her skirt, I should probably head home. James, walk me to my car. Of course. He turned to me. Eleanor, why don't you get some rest? We can clean up in the morning. They wanted to talk privately. About me, no doubt. About their next steps. About how to handle the problem I'd apparently become. That sounds lovely, I said with a smile that felt foreign on my face. Take your time. I watched from the window as they stood by Susan's car, their heads together in intense conversation. Susan was gesturing emphatically, probably frustrated that I hadn't completely fallen apart. James kept glancing back at the house, as if he expected me to be watching. Which I was. After 20 minutes, Susan drove away and James came back inside. He found me in the living room, sitting in my mother's old armchair with the torn photograph pieces arranged on the side table beside me like a puzzle waiting to be solved. "Eleanor," he said carefully, "I want you to know that what happened tonight, I was just trying to help you. Sometimes people need a push to move forward." "A push," I repeated. "Is that what you call it?" "Yes. You've been stuck in grief for 3 years. It's not healthy. Susan and I have been worried about you." So worried, I thought, that you tried to steal my house. But I didn't say that. Not yet. "I see," I said instead. "And you think destroying my mother's photograph was helpful?" He had the grace to look slightly ashamed. "Maybe I went too far. But Eleanor, you have to admit that your attachment to your mother's memory has become excessive. Excessive. Like loving someone who'd sacrificed everything for me was some kind of character flaw." "James," I said, my voice calm and measured, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. This is my house. It was my parents' house, and they left it to me, not to us. To me." His face went very still. "Eleanor, what are you talking about? We've been married 20 years. This is our home." "No," I said, standing up. "It's my home. You live here because I allow you to live here. Just like Susan comes here because I allow her to come here. But this has always been my house." "You're being ridiculous. Marriage means a lot of things," I interrupted. "But it doesn't mean you get to destroy what matters to me. It doesn't mean you get to humiliate me in my own dining room. And it certainly doesn't mean you get to make me feel like a stranger in the house my parents died to leave me." James's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. In 20 years of marriage, I had never spoken to him like this. I had never asserted ownership of anything, never claimed my space, never defended my ground. "Eleanor, you're upset. You're not thinking clearly." "Actually," I said, moving toward the stairs, "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years. I'm going to bed now, in my bedroom, in my house. We'll talk more tomorrow." I left him standing in the living room, probably trying to figure out what had just happened. As I climbed the stairs, I felt lighter with each step. For the first time in decades, I had spoken my truth. I had claimed my space, and tomorrow I would learn what other truths my mother had left for me to discover. The torn pieces of her photograph were still in my hand, but somehow they didn't feel like endings anymore. They felt like beginnings. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw James reaching across the table, his hands closing around my mother's photograph with such deliberate cruelty. But worse than the memory was the realization of how many signs I'd missed, how many red flags I'd ignored because I'd wanted so desperately to believe in the life we'd built together. By 6 a.m, I was dressed and sitting at my kitchen table with coffee, staring at the torn pieces of the photograph I'd carefully arranged on a paper towel. In the early morning light, my mother's fractured smile seemed to be encouraging me somehow. James appeared in the doorway around 7, already dressed for work. He looked like he hadn't slept much either, his usually perfect hair slightly mussed, his tie not quite straight. "Eleanor," he said cautiously, "about last night, I think we both said things we didn't mean." "I meant everything I said," I replied without looking up from my coffee. He shifted uncomfortably. "You're still upset. That's understandable. But this house belongs to both of us, Eleanor. We've built a life here together." "No, James. You've built a life here. I've just been existing in it." He moved closer, using that gentle voice he employed when he thought I was being emotional. "That's not true. You're my wife. This is our home. Our life." I finally looked up at him. "When was the last time we made a decision together about this house? About anything important? We make decisions all the time. Name one." The silence stretched between us. He couldn't, because we both knew the truth. Every major decision about the house, about our life, about my role in it, had been made by him. I had been consulted the way one might ask a child what they preferred for lunch. "I have some errands to run today," I said. standing up and rinsing my coffee cup. "Don't wait dinner for me." "What kind of errands?" The question came out sharper than he'd probably intended, with an edge of suspicion that confirmed everything I'd begun to understand about our marriage. "Just errands, James." I left him standing in the kitchen, probably wondering what had happened to the compliant woman he'd married. As I drove toward the lawyer's office, I felt like I was driving toward a different version of myself. The law offices of Holbrook, Myers & Associates occupied the top floor of a converted Victorian mansion downtown. Richard Holbrook turned out to be a man in his 60s with kind eyes and an air of competence that immediately put me at ease. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, rising from behind his desk as his secretary showed me in. "Thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." The office was warm and professional, lined with law books and family photographs. On his desk sat a thick manila folder with my name written on it in my mother's familiar handwriting. "Before we begin," he said, settling back into his chair, "I want you to know that your mother was one of the most prepared clients I've ever worked with. She anticipated almost every scenario we're dealing with today." "How did she know?" I asked. "How could she have known that James would try to have me declared incompetent?" Mr. Holbrook opened the folder and pulled out a sealed envelope. "She didn't know the specifics, but she knew enough about your husband's character to prepare for the worst-case scenario. She left this letter for you, to be opened only when you were ready to hear what she had to say." My hands trembled as I took the envelope. My name was written across it in my mother's careful script, along with the words, "When you're ready to see the truth." Inside was a letter dated just 6 months before her death. "My dearest Eleanor," it began, "if you're reading this, it means that James has finally shown you who he really is. I'm sorry it took so long, and I'm sorry I won't be there to help you through what comes next, but I want you to know that I've been preparing for this day since the moment you married him." I looked up at Mr. Holbrook, who was watching me with gentle patience. "She knew." "Keep reading," he said quietly. "I never trusted James," the letter continued. "Not from the beginning. There was something about the way he looked at our house during your engagement, the way he asked so many questions about your inheritance, the way he discouraged you from maintaining relationships with anyone who might see through his charm. But you loved him, and I wanted to be wrong." My throat tightened. She had been trying to warn me, in her subtle way, but I'd been too infatuated to listen. "Over the years, I watched him isolate you from your friends, dismiss your opinions, and gradually make you smaller and smaller in your own life. I saw how you stopped mentioning your dreams, stopped defending your thoughts, stopped being the strong, independent woman I raised. It broke my heart, but I knew that you had to see it for yourself." I had to stop reading for a moment. The truth of her words was almost too much to bear. "So, I made preparations," the letter went on. "I hired a private investigator to look into James's background and his current activities. What we found will shock you, but it will also free you. Mr. Holbrook has all the documentation." I looked at the lawyer again. "What did she find?" He pulled out another folder, this one much thicker. "Your husband has been systematically stealing from you for years. Mrs. Patterson, he's been intercepting insurance payments, tax refunds, even dividends from investments your parents left you. Money that should have come to you has been diverted to accounts he controls." The room seemed to spin. "How much?" "Over the past 10 years, nearly $200,000. $200,000. I felt sick. "How is that possible? I would have noticed." "He's been very clever about it. He handles all the household finances." "Correct? He told you that your parents left you very little, that the house was mortgaged, that you were lucky he was willing to take care of you financially." I nodded, remembering how grateful I'd been for his generosity in supporting me. "The truth is, Mrs. Patterson, you're quite wealthy. Your parents left you a substantial inheritance, including this house free and clear, plus investment accounts that have been growing for decades. James has been stealing your money and making you feel dependent on him." I thought of all the times I'd apologized for household expenses, all the times I'd felt guilty for not contributing financially to our marriage. Meanwhile, he'd been living off my inheritance while making me feel like a burden. "There's more," Mr. Holbrook said gently. The attempted guardianship petition? It wasn't his first try. He's been researching how to gain control of your assets for over a year. Your mother's investigator documented everything. He showed me photographs of James meeting with other lawyers, documents he'd tried to forge, emails to Susan discussing their Eleanor problem. It was all there. A paper trail of betrayal that stretched back years. Susan knew? I asked, though I already knew the answer. She was his primary co-conspirator. The plan was for James to gain guardianship over you, claim you were mentally unfit to live independently, and then sell your house. Susan would help care for you in a less expensive living situation while they split the proceeds from the sale. The broken photograph on my dining table suddenly made perfect sense. It hadn't been a moment of frustration or an attempt to help me move forward. It had been part of a calculated campaign to make me seem unstable, to provide evidence for their guardianship claim. What can I do? I asked, surprised by how strong my voice sounded. That depends on what you want to do. We have enough evidence to press criminal charges for fraud and theft. We can also take immediate steps to protect your remaining assets and remove James's access to your accounts. I thought about James at home, probably calling Susan to discuss their next move, both of them confident that they were dealing with a broken woman who would eventually submit to their will. I want all of it, I said. I want the charges filed, the accounts protected, everything. Mr. Holbrook smiled. Your mother said you'd say that once you learned the truth. She left one more thing for you. He handed me a small key. Safety deposit box 247 at First National Bank. She said it contains everything you need to take back your life. As I left the lawyer's office, the key clutched in my hand. I felt a strange sense of completion. My mother had spent her final years protecting me, even knowing I might not appreciate it at the time. She'd given me the tools to free myself. I just had to be brave enough to use them. I drove to the bank, my heart pounding with anticipation and dread. Whatever was in that safety deposit box would change everything. There would be no going back to the life I'd known. No pretending that my marriage was salvageable. The safety deposit box was small but packed with documents, photographs, and a final letter from my mother. This one was shorter, written in her handwriting that had grown shakier near the end. Eleanor, it said, by now you know the truth about James. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you while I was alive, but I knew you wouldn't believe me then. You had to see it for yourself. In this box, you'll find copies of all the evidence, plus something else, the original deed to the house, which James has never seen. You'll notice that it includes a very specific clause about cohabitation rights. Your father insisted on it, and now you'll understand why. Use it well. Love, Mom. I pulled out the deed, a document I'd never actually seen despite living in the house my entire life. Most of it was standard legal language, but there, in the middle of the second page, was a clause that made my breath catch. The property could only be inherited by a blood relative of the original owners, and that inheritance was void if the inheritor was subjected to abuse, financial exploitation, or coercion by any cohabitant. In such cases, the cohabitant would forfeit any claim to the property and could be legally removed immediately. My father had somehow anticipated this situation decades ago. He'd built a trap for anyone who might try to take advantage of his daughter, and James had walked right into it. I sat in the bank's private room, surrounded by the evidence of my husband's betrayal, and felt something I hadn't experienced in 20 years. Power. Real, legal, unassailable power. It was time to go home and use it. I drove home slowly, the safety deposit box contents on the passenger seat beside me like evidence in a murder trial, which, in a way, they were. Evidence of the murder of my marriage, my trust, my sense of reality, but also evidence of something else. My mother's unwavering love and her determination to protect me even from beyond the grave. James's car was in the driveway when I pulled up, which surprised me. He usually worked late on Thursdays, often not coming home until after 8. But there he was, and Susan's car was parked behind his. They were both here, in my house, probably planning their next move. I sat in my car for a moment, gathering my courage. In a few minutes, I would walk through that front door and confront 20 years of lies. There would be no going back after this, no more pretending, no more hoping things would get better. No more being grateful for crumbs of affection from people who saw me as nothing more than a meal ticket. I gathered the documents from the passenger seat and walked to my front door. My front door. The phrase felt different now, weighted with legal truth rather than just emotional attachment. I could hear voices from the living room as I stepped inside. James and Susan were talking in low, urgent tones that stopped abruptly when they heard me enter. "Eleanor?" James called out, his voice carrying that forced cheerfulness he used when he was trying to manage me. "You're home early. How were your errands?" I walked into the living room and found them both sitting on my couch, papers spread across my coffee table. Financial documents, from what I could see. My financial documents. "Very productive," I said, setting my purse down on the side table. "What are you two working on?" Susan and James exchanged a quick glance. "Just some paperwork," James said. "Boring financial stuff. You know how it is." But I could see what was on the table now. Bank statements, investment summaries, insurance documents, all in my name. All things I'd never seen before because James had always handled the boring stuff. "Actually," I said, sitting down in the armchair across from them, "I don't know how it is. Maybe you could explain it to me." James's smile flickered. "Eleanor, you don't need to worry about these things. I've always taken care of the finances." "Yes, you have," I agreed. "You've taken very good care of them." Something in my tone made Susan look up sharply. She'd always been better at reading people than James, more attuned to undercurrents and subtleties. She sensed danger before he did. "Eleanor," she said carefully, "you seem different today. Are you feeling all right?" "I'm feeling wonderful," I said. Clear-headed. For the first time in years, actually. I reached into my purse and pulled out the letter from my mother, the one from the safety deposit box. "I got some interesting mail today. Well, not mail exactly. More like a message from the past." James was frowning now, his politician's smile finally fading. "What kind of message?" I unfolded the letter and read aloud. "By now you know the truth about James. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you while I was alive, but I knew you wouldn't believe me then." The silence that followed was deafening. James had gone very still, and Susan's face had drained of color. "Eleanor," James said slowly, "what is that?" "It's a letter from my mother. She left it for me in a safety deposit box, along with some other very interesting documents." I pulled out the bank statements showing the diverted funds. "Like these, showing where my inheritance has been going for the past 10 years. James stood up abruptly, his hands clenched at his sides. "Eleanor, you're clearly upset about something, but—" "Upset?" I laughed, and the sound surprised even me. It was the first genuine laugh I'd had in months. "Oh, James, I'm not upset. I'm furious. There's a difference." Susan was gathering the papers from the coffee table, trying to shuffle them out of sight, but I'd already seen enough. Investment accounts I didn't know existed, insurance payouts that had never reached me, tax refunds that had been deposited into accounts with only James's name on them. "Susan," I said pleasantly, "you can stop hiding those. I have copies of everything." She froze, a stack of papers halfway to her purse. "Copies of what?" I pulled out the investigator's report, thick with photographs and documented evidence. "Copies of your meetings with 3 different lawyers about having me declared incompetent. Copies of emails discussing my mental state. Copies of the forged documents James tried to file with the court." James sat down heavily, his face gray. "Eleanor, let me explain." "Oh, please do," I said, settling back in my chair. "Explain how you've been stealing my inheritance for a decade while making me feel guilty for not contributing to household expenses. Explain how you've been planning to have me declared mentally unfit so you could sell my house and put me in some kind of care facility. Please, James, I'm fascinated to hear your explanation." The mask was off now. The charming, caring husband disappeared, replaced by someone I'd never seen before. Someone cold and calculating and angry at being caught. "You ungrateful bitch," he snarled. "Do you have any idea what I've sacrificed for you? 20 years of my life, tied to a pathetic woman who can't even function without constant support. What you've sacrificed?" I stood up, the investigator's report clutched in my hands. "You've been living off my money for 20 years. You've never supported me, James. I've been supporting you. Susan jumped to her feet. Eleanor, you need to calm down. You're not thinking rationally. I'm thinking more rationally than I have in decades, I shot back. And you, Susan, are just as bad as he is. All those comments about how lucky I was to have James, how grateful I should be that he was willing to take care of me. You knew the whole time that he was the one living off my family's money. That money should have been shared, James said, his voice rising. We're married. What's yours is mine. No, I said firmly. What's mine is mine. And what you've stolen from me is going to be returned with interest. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I'd memorized that morning. Mr. Holbrook, it's Eleanor Patterson. Yes, I'm ready to proceed with everything we discussed. James lunged for the phone, but I stepped back, keeping it pressed to my ear. The criminal charges, the asset recovery, all of it. And I'd like to invoke the cohabitation clause we discussed. I could hear James asking what cohabitation clause meant, but I ignored him, listening to Mr. Holbrook's instructions. Yes, I understand, I said into the phone. They'll be served tonight? Excellent, thank you. I hung up and looked at the two people who had spent years undermining me, stealing from me, planning to dispose of me like an inconvenient piece of furniture. James, I said calmly, you have 2 hours to pack your belongings and leave my house. Susan, you're no longer welcome here, ever. You can't throw me out, James said, his voice desperate now. This is my home too. We're married. I pulled out the deed with its special clause, the one my father had somehow known I'd need someday. Actually, I can. According to this document, any cohabitant who subjects me to financial exploitation or emotional abuse forfeits all rights to this property. And since you've been doing both for 20 years, you no longer have any legal claim to live here? Susan was reading over my shoulder, her face growing paler with each word. This can't be legal. It's perfectly legal. My father was a very smart man, and he had a very good lawyer. The same law firm, actually, that's been protecting my interests since my mother's death. James was staring at the deed like it was written in a foreign language. Eleanor, be reasonable. We can work this out. I'll pay back the money, we'll go to counseling, we'll start over. Start over? I repeated. James, you tried to have me declared mentally incompetent so you could steal my house. You destroyed my mother's photograph to make me seem unstable. You've been stealing from me for a decade while making me feel grateful for your support. There's no starting over from that. Susan had moved toward the door, clearly recognizing that the situation was beyond salvaging. But James wasn't giving up so easily. Eleanor, you're making a mistake. You can't survive on your own. You haven't worked in 20 years. You don't know how to manage finances or handle the house maintenance or deal with any of the practical aspects of life. You need me. I looked at this man who had spent 2 decades convincing me I was helpless, and I felt something settle into place inside me. Something strong and sure and completely unshakable. James, I said quietly, I've been managing this house since before I met you. I've been managing the finances without even knowing it, since apparently all the money was mine anyway. And as for not being able to survive on my own, I smiled. I've been surviving on my own for 20 years. I just didn't realize it because you were so good at taking credit for my money and my strength. The doorbell rang, sharp and official. Through the front window, I could see 2 police officers on my porch, along with someone in a suit who was probably a process server. That would be your eviction notice, I said, moving toward the door, and probably your arrest warrant for fraud and theft. James's face had gone completely white. Eleanor, please, don't do this. We can fix this. I opened the door to let the officers in, then turned back to him one last time. The only thing that needed fixing, James, was my willingness to let you treat me like I didn't matter. That's been fixed. As the officers explained the charges and the process server handed James his papers, I walked upstairs to my bedroom in my house, which I would never again have to share with someone who saw me as nothing more than a source of income. From my window, I watched as James and Susan were escorted to separate police cars. 20 years of marriage, ending with flashing lights and legal documents. But for the first time in decades, I felt free. I went back downstairs and gathered up the torn pieces of my mother's photograph from the kitchen counter where I'd left them that morning. In my father's study, I found a tube of photo adhesive and spent the next hour carefully putting her back together. She wasn't perfect when I finished. The cracks were still visible, the tears obvious, but she was whole again, and she was smiling, and she was mine, just like I was. The house felt different after the police cars pulled away, larger somehow, as if removing James and Susan had created space for something I'd forgotten existed. Peace. I walked through the rooms that evening, seeing them with new eyes. My living room, my kitchen, my dining room where James had torn up my mother's photograph just 24 hours ago. It felt like a lifetime had passed since then. I was sitting in my father's study, the restored photograph of my mother propped on his old desk, when the phone rang again. The caller ID showed a local number I didn't recognize. Mrs. Patterson? This is Detective Martinez with the County Fraud Division. I wanted to update you on the charges filed against your husband and his sister. I gripped the phone tighter. What's the update? James Patterson has been charged with financial fraud, identity theft, and attempted guardianship fraud. The evidence your mother's investigator gathered is substantial. Susan Patterson is being charged as an accessory to fraud and conspiracy. Both are being held pending bail hearings. How long could they be sentenced for? If convicted on all charges, James could face up to 15 years. Susan, as an accessory, probably 5 to 7 years. But Mrs. Patterson, there's something else you should know. I waited, not sure I wanted to hear what came next. When we arrested James, he had documents with him showing he'd already contacted a real estate agent about listing your house. The appointment was scheduled for tomorrow morning. My stomach clenched. If I hadn't gone to see Mr. Holbrook, if I hadn't learned the truth when I did, James might have succeeded in having me declared incompetent. By next week, I could have been in some kind of care facility while he sold my family home out from under me. Mrs. Patterson, are you there? Yes, I'm here. Thank you for letting me know. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet of my father's study for a long time. The man I'd been married to for 20 years had been planning to steal my house and abandon me in an institution. The woman I'd tried so hard to please, his sister, had been actively helping him destroy my life. But somehow, I felt more grateful than angry. Grateful to my mother for protecting me even after death. Grateful to my father for his foresight in that cohabitation clause. Grateful to myself for finally finding the courage to fight back. The next morning brought a parade of visitors. First came Mr. Holbrook with more paperwork, then a locksmith to change all the exterior locks, then a representative from the bank to help me regain control of all my accounts. Mrs. Patterson, the bank representative said, reviewing my files, I have to say your mother was remarkably thorough in protecting your interests. She set up monitoring on all these accounts years ago. We've been tracking the unauthorized transfers, and we should be able to recover most of the stolen funds. Most of them. James spent quite a bit on what appeared to be gambling debts and other expenses. But the majority of your inheritance is recoverable. You're looking at roughly $1.8 million once everything is sorted out. I nearly dropped my coffee cup. 1.8 million? Your parents were very wise investors, Mrs. Patterson. And the house alone is worth about $600,000 in today's market. You're a wealthy woman. A wealthy woman. I'd lived for 20 years believing I was financially dependent on a husband who was actually stealing from me. I'd felt guilty about grocery bills while sitting on nearly $2 million. That afternoon, I decided to do something I hadn't done in decades. I went shopping, not for necessities or practical items, but for things I wanted, things that would make me happy. I bought new sheets for my bed, in colors I loved instead of the neutral tones James had always preferred. I bought artwork for the walls, pieces that spoke to me rather than matching some decorator's vision of what was appropriate. I bought books, stacks and stacks of books, because I'd always loved reading, but James had complained that my books made the house look cluttered. Most importantly, I bought a beautiful new frame for my mother's photograph. Silver, like the old one, but larger and more ornate. When I got home, I placed it in the center of the mantelpiece in the living room, where everyone who entered would see her smiling face. The doorbell rang while I was arranging my new books on the shelves in the living room. Through the window, I could see a woman about my age, nicely dressed but nervous looking, standing on my porch. I opened the door cautiously. "Can I help you, Mrs. Patterson? My name is Carol Mitchell. I was James's secretary at his office." She twisted her hands nervously. "I wondered if I could speak with you for a moment." I hesitated, then stepped aside to let her in. She perched on the edge of the couch, looking around the room with curious eyes. "I heard about James's arrest," she said without preamble. "The whole office is talking about it, and Mrs. Patterson, I think there are some things you should know." "What kind of things?" She reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope. "James asked me to handle some of his personal correspondence over the years. I thought it was just normal secretarial work, but after hearing about the charges," she shook her head, "I realize now that I was helping him commit fraud without knowing it." She handed me the envelope. Inside were copies of letters, emails, and documents that painted an even more disturbing picture of James's deception. "He's been intercepting your mail for years," Carol said. "Insurance company letters, bank statements, legal documents. He had them sent to a P.O. box and then would bring them to the office for me to file. I thought it was just overflow from your home office." I stared at a stack of unopened letters from my insurance company, dating back 5 years. Claims payouts I'd never received, policy updates I'd never seen. "There's more," Carol continued. "He had me make appointments with elder care attorneys, real estate agents, even some doctors who specialize in mental competency evaluations. He told me it was research for a friend's family situation." "When did this start?" "About 3 years ago, right after your mother passed away." She looked at me with genuine remorse. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm so sorry. If I had known what he was really doing." "You couldn't have known," I said, though part of me wondered how many other people had been unknowingly complicit in James's plans. "Thank you for bringing this to me." After Carol left, I called Detective Martinez and turned over the new evidence. Then I sat in my living room, surrounded by my new books and artwork, and tried to process the full scope of James's betrayal. He hadn't just been stealing money. He'd been systematically isolating me from information about my own life, preparing for the day when he could claim I was too incompetent to manage my affairs. The appointment with the real estate agent wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was the culmination of a 3-year plan that had begun the moment my mother died and could no longer protect me. That evening, Susan called from jail. "Eleanor, please," she said when I reluctantly accepted the collect call. "You have to drop these charges. James is my brother. He's all the family I have left. He's a thief and a fraud," I replied calmly. "And so are you. We never meant to hurt you. We were just trying to secure our futures. You don't understand what it's like to not have the security of inherited money." The audacity of it took my breath away. Security of inherited money? Susan, that was my parents' money. Money they worked their entire lives to leave to me. James stole it and you helped him. But you don't need all of it. You're just one person. James and I could have made better use of it. I hung up without responding. Let her spend her time in jail thinking about better uses for stolen money. The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal proceedings, financial restructuring, and the strange process of reclaiming my own life. I had to relearn how to make decisions without considering James's opinions, how to spend money without guilt, how to exist in my own space without constantly adapting to someone else's preferences. Some days were harder than others. 20 years of conditioning didn't disappear overnight. I'd catch myself hesitating before buying something I wanted, or automatically preparing meals the way James liked them, or arranging furniture to accommodate his preferences. But gradually, I began to rediscover who Eleanor Patterson was when she wasn't trying to be who James Patterson wanted her to be. I started gardening again, something I'd loved before marriage but had abandoned because James complained about dirt being tracked into the house. I joined a book club at the local library. I took a painting class at the community center. Most importantly, I began to understand that my mother's final gift hadn't just been the legal protection and financial documentation she'd left for me. It had been the reminder that I was worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth saving. 1 month after James's arrest, I received a letter from him in jail. He was asking for my forgiveness, promising to change, begging me to drop the charges and take him back. I read it once, then put it through the paper shredder in my father's study. Some papers, like some relationships, weren't worth keeping in any form. The torn photograph of my mother, carefully restored and beautifully framed, watched from the mantelpiece as I fed James's letter into the shredder. Her smile seemed to approve. I was finally free, and I intended to stay that way. 6 months after James's arrest, I stood in my garden on a warm September morning, my hands deep in the rich soil, planting the last of the fall bulbs. Daffodils and tulips that would bloom next spring, in a garden that was finally, completely mine. The house behind me had been transformed, not through expensive renovations or dramatic changes, but through the simple act of filling it with things I loved instead of things I thought I should love. The neutral beiges and grays that James had preferred were gone, replaced by warm yellows and deep blues. My books filled every shelf, my mother's photographs graced every room, and the air seemed lighter somehow, as if the house itself was breathing easier. Mrs. Patterson? I turned to see a young woman standing at my garden gate, holding a small child's hand. She looked nervous but determined, the way people do when they're about to ask for something important. Yes? I'm Jennifer Walsh. I live 2 streets over, on Elm Street. I heard about what happened with your husband. I was wondering if I could talk to you. I brushed the soil from my hands and walked over to the gate. The little girl with her, maybe 4 or 5 years old, was hiding behind Jennifer's legs, peering at me with curious eyes. Of course. Would you like to come in? I was just about to make some tea. Jennifer's face showed relief. That would be wonderful. Thank you. We settled on my back patio, the little girl playing with a doll while Jennifer and I talked. She was younger than I'd initially thought, probably in her early 30s, with tired eyes and the careful posture of someone who'd learned to be wary. Mrs. Patterson, she began, I hope this isn't inappropriate, but I heard that you had a husband who tried to control your finances and make you think you were incompetent. I set down my teacup. Yes, that's true. My husband does the same thing. The words tumbled out in a rush. He tells me I'm too stupid to handle money, that I'd lose everything if he didn't manage it all. He says I'm lucky he puts up with me because no one else would want a woman who can't even balance a checkbook. I looked at this young woman, seeing myself 25 years ago, and felt my heart clench. How long has this been going on? 6 years? Since right after Emma was born? She glanced at her daughter, who was absorbed in her play. It started small, you know? He said pregnancy brain had made me forgetful, that he was just helping by taking over the bills. Then it became everything. I can't even buy groceries without asking permission. Do you have access to any money at all? Jennifer shook her head. He gives me $20 a week for personal expenses. If I spend it all, he lectures me about being irresponsible with money. If I don't spend it all, he takes it back and says I clearly didn't need it. The cruelty was so familiar, it made my stomach ache. Jennifer, do you know anything about your family's actual financial situation? He says we're barely getting by, that my staying home with Emma is a luxury we can barely afford, but he's willing to sacrifice because he's a good father. Her voice was flat, defeated. But Mrs. Patterson, I know he's lying about some things. We live in a nice house. He drives an expensive car, and I found credit card statements showing charges at expensive restaurants and hotels when he was supposedly at work conferences. Have you thought about leaving? With what money? He says I haven't worked in years, that no one would hire someone with such a big gap in her resume. He says if I left, I'd end up homeless with Emma, and the court would give her to him because he's the stable parent with income. I looked at this young woman, trapped in the same web of lies and manipulation that had held me for 20 years, and made a decision. Jennifer, would you like me to make some phone calls? Her eyes widened. What kind of calls? To my lawyer, to a private investigator, to some people who specialize in helping women in your situation. I leaned forward. The things your husband is telling you? They're lies. All of them. Just like the things my husband told me were lies. For the first time since she'd arrived, Jennifer looked hopeful. You really think? I think you deserve to know the truth about your own life. And I think Emma deserves to grow up with a mother who knows her own worth. That afternoon, I made the first of many phone calls. Mr. Holbrook agreed to meet with Jennifer pro bono. The private investigator who had helped my mother was available for another case. I contacted a women's shelter that provided legal advocacy and financial counseling. But more than that, I realized I had found my purpose. The money my parents had left me, the money James had tried to steal, could be used to help other women escape the same trap I'd been caught in for 2 decades. Over the following weeks, Jennifer's story unfolded in ways that were both heartbreaking and infuriating. Her husband had been siphoning money from joint accounts into personal investments, had been lying about their income and expenses, and had been systematically destroying her confidence and independence. Sound familiar? But unlike my situation, Jennifer's had the advantage of early intervention. She was young, her daughter was young, and she had someone to help her who understood exactly what she was going through. The day Jennifer served her husband with divorce papers and moved into a temporary apartment with Emma, she called me from her new phone, the first phone she'd had access to in 6 years. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, and I could hear tears in her voice. "I can't thank you enough. For the first time in years, I feel like I can breathe." That evening, I sat in my father's study, looking at the small pile of letters that had begun arriving. Word had somehow gotten out about what I'd done to help Jennifer, and other women were reaching out. Women trapped in similar situations, women who needed help finding their way back to themselves. I thought about my mother, about the lengths she'd gone to protect me even when I was too blind to see I needed protection. I thought about my father, whose foresight in that cohabitation clause had ultimately saved my life. I thought about the house around me, filled with their love and their wisdom, and their determination to keep me safe, and I realized that the best way to honor their memory was to use what they'd given me to help others. I called Mr. Holbrook the next morning. "I want to set up a foundation," I told him. "Something to help women who are being financially abused by their partners. Legal help, financial counseling, temporary housing if they need it." "That's a wonderful idea. Mrs. Patterson, what would you like to call it?" I looked at my mother's photograph, smiling from its place of honor on the desk. The Helen Morrison Foundation. After my mother, within a year, the foundation was up and running. We'd helped 12 women escape abusive relationships, provided legal aid to 15 more, and established a network of counselors and advocates who specialized in financial abuse cases. James was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Susan got 5 years. They both appealed, claiming the evidence against them was circumstantial, but the appeals were denied. Justice, it turned out, sometimes actually worked. I still lived alone in the house my parents had left me, but I was no longer lonely. The foundation kept me busy, and I discovered that helping other women reclaim their lives gave my own life a meaning it had never had before. On the 2nd anniversary of the night, James tore up my mother's photograph. I hosted a dinner party. Not the stiff formal affairs I'd organized to impress James's business associates, but a real celebration with people I genuinely cared about. Jennifer was there with Emma, who was now a confident 7-year-old who loved to help me in the garden. Carol, the secretary who had brought me evidence of James's fraud, had become a close friend. Several of the women the foundation had helped attended with their children. Mr. Holbrook came with his wife, and even Detective Martinez stopped by with his family. We ate in the dining room where James had committed his final act of cruelty against me, but the room felt completely different now. Instead of tension and walking on eggshells, there was laughter and genuine warmth. Instead of feeling like I had to earn my place at my own table, I felt like the queen of my own castle. As the evening wound down and my guests began to leave, Jennifer pulled me aside. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, "I need you to know something. That day I came to your garden gate, I was planning to end things. I couldn't see any way out, and I thought Emma would be better off without a mother who was such a failure." My heart stopped. "Jennifer, but then I saw you," she continued, "working in your garden, looking so peaceful and strong, and I thought, maybe there's another way. Maybe I could ask for help instead of giving up." She hugged me tightly. "You saved my life that day. You saved Emma's life." After everyone left, I walked through my house, turning off lights and enjoying the comfortable quiet. In the living room, I paused in front of my mother's photograph. now surrounded by pictures of all the people who had become my chosen family. "We did it, Mom," I whispered to her smiling face. "We saved them. We saved me." I could almost hear her voice in response. "No, sweetheart. You saved yourself. I just gave you the tools." And she was right. The legal documents and financial protection had been important, but the real salvation had come from within. From finally finding the courage to value myself, to refuse to accept treatment that diminished me, to claim my space in the world. The house settled around me with its familiar creaks and sighs, but they sounded different now, not like the groans of a structure under stress, but like the contented sounds of a home at peace. I had been Eleanor Patterson, the woman who lost herself in marriage. Then I had been Eleanor Patterson, the woman who was betrayed and nearly destroyed. Now I was Eleanor Patterson, the woman who helped other women find their way home to themselves. And I had never been happier. The torn photograph had been restored, the stolen money recovered, the abusive husband removed. But the real victory wasn't in getting back what had been taken from me. It was in discovering what had been there all along. Strength I hadn't known I possessed, worth that didn't depend on anyone else's opinion, and a life that was fully, completely, joyfully mine. In the end, James and Susan had done me a favor. By pushing me too far, by finally showing me exactly who they were, they had forced me to remember exactly who I was. And who I was, it turned out, was someone worth fighting for.